All pictures and videos are being used under the Fair Use Clause of the Copyright Act of 1976.
My name is Braxton Barnhill, and I'm using this documentary to talk about racial discrimination in the United States. Whether or not racial discrimination still exists in society today has been a hotly debated topic since the end of slavery. Due to my diverse background and upbringing, I never encountered overt racial discrimination. I can remember being taught by teachers in school that due to the efforts of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, racial discrimination was a thing that we as a society had completely overcome. Looking at the diversity of the people closest to me, I was even more likely to believe this. But at one point, my worldview abruptly changed when I started reading and hearing about situations that involved African American men like Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, and Eric Garner all be killed by police officers, and then the officers not ever get convicted or indicted for these hideous murders that they committed. This clearly brought up thoughts about racial discrimination that I had never had before. This made me question the idea of us living in a post-racial society altogether. A post-racial society, obviously, is defined as a society without discrimination. When beginning to think about the idea of us living in a post-racial society, I was slightly conflicted because there are so many people in our society that think we don't live in a post-racial society, and there are so many people in this country that, on the contrary, think that our society is post-racial and that racial discrimination doesn't exist in any fashion. Because of this, I got together with some peers that are just as interested in finding out more about this subject as I am. We want to see if racial discrimination does exist. In what ways does it exist, aside from the debated examples that the media focuses on, like police brutality? We're going to look into examples of modern-day race-based discrimination that are practical and that affect everyday life for minorities, specifically in the areas of housing, employment, and education. To do this, we compiled information on the topic and gathered interviews over the past year of citizens, activists, and professors to see if they think that we do live in a post-racial society, then why? And if they don't, then why not?
Gonna let any dogs or water hoses turn us around. We aren't gonna let any injunction turn us around.
And it is no accident that as long as the dogs were biting Negro women, Negro babies, and Negro children, Kennedy said nothing. Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot!
Many people don't believe we live in a post-racial society. To understand why this is, I want to look into how racism made its way into the Western world. I think that racism, at least in the Western Hemisphere, in most ways, began with European imperialism.
Imperialism, the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies.
European imperialism originally began with Christopher Columbus's exploration of the so-called New World, when he not discovered but arrived in the Americas in the 15th century. This started the age of exploration and caused the first wave of European imperialism. The roots of racism in regards to the United States and its history, in my opinion, can largely be traced to the European exploitation of North America, South America, and later Africa and Asia. Racism has its roots not only in the exploitation of the peoples of these continents, but specifically in the justifications European nations made for exploiting these lands, and the attitudes they had about those that they were exploiting. To find out more about imperialism and how it caused racism in the modern day, David is going to talk to Dr. David Hampton, who is a leader in the local community and very versed on the topic. Dr. David Hampton is a senior pastor at Light of the World Christian Church and is also the deputy mayor of the city of Indianapolis.
The views expressed in this interview do not reflect the city of Indianapolis or Light of the World Christian Church. The views expressed by Dr. David Hampton reflect his views as an individual and only as an individual.
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Hampton, for taking the time to do this interview with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with the question we ask everybody. Do you live in a post-racial society? And if so, why? And if not, then why not?
Yeah, I think that the term post-racial society is theoretical, and it's, I think, overly idealized. I think in reality, no, we do not live in a post-racial society. I think we live in a postmodern society, but that's not the subject of your interview. I think that with the advent of President Barack Obama, that term has probably gained a heightened awareness or usage or sensitivity. As a matter of fact, I think that we live in a neo-racist society to a certain degree. I like a term that Will Smith said, that racism hasn't gone anywhere, it's just getting filmed. If you're speaking to, some of the origins of racism, there's a book I like to reference by Martin Bernal, actually a Jewish author, who wrote a book called Black Athena. Black Athena chronicles race from a Hellenistic perspective, and he actually uncovers the roots of Egyptian origin, medicine, Imhotep, all of the Egyptian kings and queens, advances of Africans and dark people in science, math, writing, you name it. And he talks about how black people were considered royalty, from the perspective of other cultures. And it was only when Greek Hellenism adopted what they learned from Africans and then began to, in a way, as we have come to know the term, stolen culture, adopted it for themselves as if they created it, when actually they adapted or stole it, and then began for political purposes and reasons, began to make inferior or began to place blackness in a lower class, that racism as a construct or as a concept began. So racism is really a man-made socio-political phenomenon that is really used by those who are who have a need to play this inferior superior game, and it's been used to advance particular agendas. It's been used to justify war, justify killing, justify, of course, slavery, and it's been used to get ahead by many groups.
Yeah,
and I think so it certainly didn't originate in North America or the Western Hemisphere. It's something that existed
centuries.
BC, and even from a biblical perspective, Paul talked about and dealt with racism, actually dealt with race, class, and gender discrimination in Galatians chapter 3, when he said, "There's no slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female in Christ." So from a theological perspective, even in the first century, they had to deal with that. And so racism has been pervasive in American society and in our world for centuries.
Right.
There are many books written about colonialism. when you read the memoirs of Frederick Douglass, for example, he talks about how in North America, actually the first slaves were white. They would enslave one another, whether it was called indentured servitude or just slavery, and you worked off your debt. But what he chronicled was in detail how white men were unable to hold up in the sun and get some of the work done that was needed. So he compared that to black slaves that were brought over from Africa and their physical prowess and their physical ability to do what white men could not do. He literally said in his writings, one black African male slave could do the job of 3 white men. So that in the psyche of colonialist races created this hyper sexualized, hyper humanized perception of black people, that our worth and value was founded in our physical prowess, but rather than give credit that we just had physical gifts, you have to continue to make someone inferior by making them less than human and placing animalistic characteristics. So, you know, all of the stereotypes that black men have bigger genitalia, that we are bigger physically and just stronger. I mean, that some of that was hyperbole to justify using them for slaves, but it was also a way to dehumanize and to animalize. And so when you take that stereotype and it has perpetuated, here we are in the 21st century, police officers who are racist and don't have interaction and who have implicit bias, they go in with the gun in the badge with that same thought process. And that's why you see a Mike Brown and a Darren Wilson. Darren Wilson said in his mind he saw a big black Hulk. Well, Mike Brown was a 17-year-old just big boy, but he was no Hulk. But you're a man with a gun, badge, authority, and a weapon. And so in his mind, he was so filled with inferiority, and Darren Wilson's implicit bias and self-conceptualized hate made him look at this teenage boy as a Hulk, as a non-human, as an animal, dehumanized him, and he had no problem pumping however many bullets he shot it with no thought whatsoever. So the danger in I call it hyper-humanizing, but the danger in dehumanizing black men and black women is, in our society, it's dangerous for us because blackness is what is being policed. Blackness has been weaponized. In other words, we are viewed as a weapon by virtue of our color. We're viewed as criminal by virtue of our color. We are dehumanized by virtue of our color.
So it is pretty clear that racism in this country, again, has its roots in the imperialistic actions of many Western European nations during the age of exploration, and also, according to Dr. Hampton, in the beliefs of ancient Greece during the Hellenistic period. Now that we understand the cause of racism in American history, I want to learn more about the height of racism in America, specifically the time after the Civil War leading up to the Civil Rights Movement, which was where racial discrimination was made illegal. Racial discrimination, specifically in the 20th century, prevented minorities from having access to basic rights all citizens were rightfully entitled to at least have the opportunity to obtain, especially in regards to employment.
The racial divide in employment reflected the paradigm's racial hierarchy. Service and menial jobs were reserved for blacks, whether skilled or unskilled. Black workers were subjected to discriminatory treatment if they were fortunate to be hired at all. Michael Higginbotham, Ghosts of Jim Crow.
This legal discrimination lasted until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited job discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Even though this finally made employment discrimination of any kind illegal, many minorities were still prevented from well-paying jobs afterwards for many reasons, including discrimination. And all of this discrimination occurred close to 100 years after the end of slavery. To give more detail on how racial discrimination existed in employment, I spoke to Dr. Joseph Tucker Edmonds, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at IUPUI, and also a graduate of Brown and Duke University. How you doing, Dr. Edmonds? Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. So, I was wondering, so do you think that we live in a post-racial society?
I definitely don't think we live in a post-racial society. A post-racial society would suggest that Black folks and any folks that would no longer be defined by race, they would no longer be defined by their color, their economic, political, or educational pursuits would be free of both de facto, meaning racism by practice, or de jure, racism by law in their lives. They would have access to these things and would not be judged or constrained by their racial character. That's not the moment that we live in.
Right. So you think even now, even after 50, 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement, we still experience many different symptoms of a very racial society, post-racial.
We live in a very racialized apartheid society, a white supremacist society, a society that is negotiated and is segmented by racial ethnic groups or racial identities. When we look at any outcome, whether it is educational attainment, whether it's wealth accumulation, whether it is just access to certain kinds of goods, that we see over and over again when we look at that data, that it is segmented by race. That those who are white or are part of the dominant racial groups have more or easier or greater access to, and as we move down that racial hierarchy in our current system to Black and brown folks, they have less access to or more difficult time getting access to those things.
Right, exactly. So what we've been talking about in the documentary is looking at whether or not we live in a post-racial society now. Most people think that we don't, but to really understand whether we do or not, we've been looking at discrimination before the Civil Rights Movement. And looking at things like specifically employment, housing, and education, and how that type of discrimination in many ways led to discrimination in the same fields today. So what do you think specifically about employment discrimination and how that worked and played itself out specifically before the Civil Rights?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that the moment that we get the emancipation of the slaves, and we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're talking about the post-Reconstruction era, we are living in a moment where Black folks are supposed to have ostensibly or theoretically access to the labor market. We're talking about primarily Black men, right? You know, because women are still seen as second-class citizens at that time. But Black men are supposed to have access to the labor market. We know from that moment forward that never happened. We have not seen that even from the middle of the 1860s up until 2017. Access to the labor market has been impacted. Now you ask how or why. One is that the dominant governmental, political, and economic system actively worked to keep Black folks, especially Black men, out of the labor market, or to put them in particular positions in the labor market, I always give the example of a sharecropper, that you were allowed access into the labor market, right after enslavement, but only under the thumb of a formerly enslaver, and on the land of the plantation that you were just on, at a wage that was really despicable and was often hard to get, often did not come often, that came with a lot of debt, and therefore you were always, from the very beginning of our entry into ostensibly the labor market, we were never allowed to really achieve any success or to achieve any upward mobility in that labor system.
Exactly. And so how do you think things like segregation played into employment discrimination and minorities never, like you said, having full access to the job market?
Right. I mean, I think there's a number of ways. First of all, there were so many jobs and opportunities where certain kinds of people, Black and brown men, were not allowed to enter in, So segregation, white supremacy, racist, economic and political and hiring practices excluded black folks from a number of jobs, right? And so as a result, that meant you were not able to develop the skill set, the requisite skill set to participate in that labor market. You weren't able to oftentimes get the education necessary to participate in that market. And even if you had the skills and the education and even access, oftentimes you were not allowed to participate because of what would eventually be, brotherhoods or mutual aid societies, and eventually become labor unions, which excluded folks from participating in particular kinds of jobs or careers. And so ultimately, black and brown bodies were not allowed to participate because of a racist and segregated society. So the jobs that black and brown folks were allowed to have were often ones that were at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, at the bottom of the pay wage scale, and often ones that led to increased and advanced health issues and increased and advanced separation from one's family. And so we see the decay of the body, the physical body of these workers, but also the decay of the moral and social body of the black community because of the opportunities made available to them.
Exactly. So then now, how would you say that the idea of black criminality played into employment discrimination and minorities just in general, or you could just say overall minority criminality, because Latinos, African Americans, and even Asians at different points in American history have all been stereotyped as being criminals. How do you think that has played into the lack of job access?
It's incredible. It's I think one if not number one, the number two reason, right? The number one reason I would say is the overall general system of white supremacy and racism that says we're going to exclude certain people from the market by any means necessary, right? We have to use violence against them. If we have to, destroy their towns like the Tulsa riots, if we have to, limit their access to education. But number two, if not number one, would be the criminalization or the dehumanization of black, brown, and yellow bodies, right? Because what happens immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation is that black folks and enslaved folks are said, you're free. You can participate in economically, politically, and socially, right? That's the theoretical argument. However, what happens is that the moment they are made free to participate, the legal system, the criminal justice system comes in and says, well, we see you as free, but as a free criminal, right? As a problematic subject, as monstrous, as the potential to do harm, right? And so this criminalized body becomes something that becomes very suspicious or problematic in terms of the hiring process, in terms of the integration process, in terms of the larger assimilation process. So you say, if all black folks are dangerous and criminals, we can't hire them to count our money. We can't trust them to not steal our materials. We can't allow them to be around our women and our children. You see how this plays out, right? And this plays out for black and brown folks, for Native American folks, for Asian folks. These become ways to suggest that we can exclude them from the economic market.
And it'd be okay.
And it'd be okay because we have the support and the logic of a criminal justice system that says that they are bad, and then how do we support that with objective data? We start to arrest them. We actually start to criminalize them, right? So the major way at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and we see this happening today, is that we criminalize black folks for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? We call truancy or a vagrancy or trespassing, right? Black folks are in the wrong neighborhood. They're at their job site past the time they're supposed to be at home. They're not in school, or they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or driving on the wrong side of town. And then that becomes a way to immediately say they are criminals. We then criminalize that act, which was just an act of being the wrong color in the wrong place. You now have a record. You now have a stereotype. And then now when you go to apply or to try to enter into the labor market, you are now branded as someone who should be paid less, someone who should be trusted less, someone that should be given less opportunities, and that then leads into a segmented and segregated labor market that has had impact all the way down into our current moment.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Edmonds, you've been more than helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Before the Civil Rights Movement, discrimination and segregation was very notable in the housing market.
Over the years, the critical effects of housing segregation have been extensively detailed. Housing segregation caused excessive issues in many minority communities and exacerbated the consequences of poverty and other issues that affected mostly minorities, like redlining. In the early to mid-20th century, redlining was very common. Redlining is the practice of denying services, either directly or through selectively raising prices to residents of certain areas based on the racial or ethnic makeups of those areas. Many urban, high-minority neighborhoods went into decay and became substandard due to the discriminatory practice of redlining. It was common for minorities to be bullied out of white neighborhoods, so moving to neighborhoods that weren't held back by redlining was very difficult for many minority groups to accomplish during this era.
The Federal Housing Agency, which was created in 1934, worsened the effects of housing segregation. The agency created a loan program, which pushed banks to write loans to working-class white families who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford these loans. This loan program, and many just like it, would not give loans to minorities, furthering the effects of limited opportunities in the housing market. There are a variety of other examples that help detail the way in which housing discrimination worked. One example can be seen after World War II ended, with how the resources from the GI Bill were distributed. The GI Bill was created to help World War II veterans readjust to civilian life after the war. It offered housing loans, amongst many other benefits, including free tuition and $4 billion worth of unemployment to those that served in the war. The GI Bill helped create and expand the white middle class of the 1950s that has now, for many Americans, become synonymous with that era. African Americans and other minorities that fought for our country and risked their lives in the war were almost completely excluded from receiving many of the benefits that came with the GI Bill. According to Tim Wise, author of the book Colorblind, the housing loans from the GI Bill, along with the housing loans from the Federal Housing Agency, both actively practiced racial discrimination and also at the same time accounted for 40% of all mortgages by 1962. Towns and cities all over the country not only allowed housing segregation, but some even made it law. For example, in 1911 in Richmond, Virginia, it was a crime for any black person to step foot in an area that was labeled a white district. Another extreme example of racial separation was the sundown town. The term was derived from requirements that all blacks having business in that town had to leave by night or risk bodily harm. In his book, Higginbotham states that by 1948, there were over 3,000 sundown towns in the country, including Pierce City, Missouri, and Anna, Illinois. Housing segregation led to many issues, including cultural isolation and the disadvantages that can come with the concentration of poverty. Housing segregation created a nation in which the best opportunities in this country were out of reach for minorities, metaphorically and physically, because of racial discrimination. Racial segregation overall created a society in which being a person of color automatically meant you got the worst of what society had to offer. This was the case especially when it came to education. Before the Civil Rights Movement, the schools that minority students went to didn't receive nearly as much funding from states as white schools. So the schools that minorities were being segregated into were inherently substandard compared to the schools that had all white students. Before going into historical discrimination in education further, I wanted to speak with Dr. Leah Gunning Francis. Dr. Francis is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana.
She is also the author of the book, Ferguson and Faith. All right, I'm here with Dr. Leah Gunning Francis. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So I just wanted to start off with a question that we've been asking everyone. Do you think that we live in a post-racial society? And if so, why? And then if not, why not?
Well, I don't think the evidence suggests that we live in a post-racial society. To say we live in a post-racial society seems to intimate that matters of race or racism are something that are inconsequential, and we know that that's just not true.
Right, definitely. So one of the things that we've been looking at is discrimination in society all across the board, specifically before the Civil Rights Movement. And right now we're focusing on education. And how do you think, in general, that discrimination in education played itself out?
Well, when we look historically, for African Americans in the United States, where for so many years, decades, centuries, it was illegal for Black people to read or write in the United States. And so when it came time for that to be able to happen in terms of Black people being able to enter into schools that were segregated schools and often not only separate but unequal. They were underfunded, they were underutilized, they were under resourced, and as a result of that, it just continued this multi-tiered status of education in this country. I mean, it was ingrained in the bedrock in the founding of this country. Education was never put on an equal plane.
So you mentioned the separate but equal doctrine. Why do you think they had that doctrine?
It's hard to say specifically, but what is documented is that there are divergent views on that. There is not a unilateral understanding or approach to thinking about what this document means. And so it's incumbent upon us, here we are in 2017, running up quickly on 2018, what does separate what does equal look like today? Technically, it's not separate, but clearly it's unequal. So, in terms of why that document was created, leads us to really think seriously about what have the effects of that document meant to us up to this very day, and what does real education reform look like today.
Exactly. So what other vehicles, I guess, do you think, specifically before, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, what other vehicles do you think caused that inequality of education, aside from maybe, the separate but equal doctrine? Or do you think it would just be primarily that? Or
No, it definitely wasn't just primarily that. I mean, I think just the very basis of this country. I mean, first off, you have to remember that when Black people were brought enslaved to this country, in the 1600s, that, very early on, Black people were declared as subhuman, as 3/5 of a human being. And that ethos has played itself out up until this very day. And so, by no means was just one document or one law with the Brown versus Board of Education, was that the determining factor for the course of education. This course was set a long time ago, and it's having, some real detrimental effects to this day.
So I just wanted to touch briefly on how, just in general, you think having that inadequate education, you have generations of families. You have Latinos, you have Asian Americans, African Americans, and how do you think that would have affected their lives in other areas?
Well, the data shows that when people are undereducated or have not been educated at all, that their earnings typically are lower. Their life experiences are not necessarily the same as people that have higher levels of education, just because of access, just because of the disposable income that affords people the opportunity to travel and have new experiences and eat different types of foods. It really can have a serious impact on one's quality of life. So in addition to just the intellectual development of the mind, of the body, or the physical development of the body, or the emotional, psychosocial development, it cuts across all of those things. And the data has shown that access to a high quality education is often an indicator of having higher outcomes in these other areas of life.
So definitely. definitely can just, make it difficult for every other aspect of life.
Yeah, the
Having
data shows that.
Right. And then especially when you look at it for generations, I mean, it can definitely, hold, an entire group of people back. And so, yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
I mean, when we think about the number of students, we're now embarking upon a brand new academic year.
Right.
And we're relatively new to Indianapolis and have been still meeting lots of new people, which has been great. But I have to remember every time I hear somebody say, I'm a first generation college student, that is still something that is true and actual for so many people in this country, and especially for African Americans. But when we put that in the context of the history of the way in which we have not only been denied access to education, but the way in which we were legally bound from being educated. Here we are in 2017, and to have such a significant number of people saying they're first generation college students is just absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm a third generation college student, and it's just startling and a really sobering reminder of what that means in 2017 for a young person coming out of a family to be a first person to go to college.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sitting down and speaking with us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Thanks.
In 1900, it is estimated that in the 16 former slave states, the average African American child received half as much educational funding as the average white child. Some states like South Carolina were even worse. Reports from that state indicate that African Americans, who made up 61% of the state's population, only received 20% of school funds. Some schools in the South didn't even have high schools for African Americans to attend. In the western part of the country, where most Hispanic and Asian Americans lived at the time, it wasn't much better. There were more schooling options for them than for African Americans in the South, but the disparity on school funding was very similar. This would mean that minority children all across the country received inadequate educations as a result of their schools not getting enough money. The fact that the schools that minorities attended didn't receive enough money was a direct result of racial segregation. Minority schools being isolated made it very easy for their schools to be neglected, or at least come second to all white schools.
There are many more examples of racial inequity, oppression, and discrimination that have had their mark on American history. These examples help detail the severity of racial oppression and the effects of it. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs that helped reignite the nation's economy after the Great Depression provide a clear example not only of discrimination, but racial preferential treatment, specifically the Social Security policies that were created by the New Deal. They discriminated against minorities, and specifically African Americans, by not allowing those that were domestic workers and agricultural laborers to benefit from the policies. At the time, 95% of domestic workers and 93% of agricultural laborers were African American. So the fact that the incredibly vital Social Security program did not include domestic workers and agricultural laborers meant that it did not include many African American people. Another example of serious racial discrimination can be found in the forced sterilization practices that went on in the United States, primarily from the 1890s to the 1970s. These policies enacted all over the country were backed by a belief in eugenics, which is an attempt to improve the genetic qualities of a population, typically by preventing the reproduction of groups that are seen as inferior. Often, people of color, criminals, and the mentally disabled were all labeled as inferior, targeted, and forcefully sterilized. Compulsory sterilization is usually associated with the Nazis, but 32 US states practiced eugenics up to 30 years before Germany's Third Reich ever did. In 1907, the state of Indiana was the first legislative body in the world to pass sterilization laws, and over 2,000 sterilizations were done in the state by the 1970s. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments present yet another example of institutional racism well into the 20th century. Between 1932 and 1972, a team of doctors and researchers were studying syphilis on behalf of the government in Tuskegee, Alabama. In order to study the degenerative effects of syphilis, they watched 399 African American men with syphilis slowly deteriorate for over 40 years. The patients never received treatment and were never even told that they had syphilis. The study continued for 27 years after a cure for syphilis had already been found. The study was approved over and over again by various local and national agencies, including the Center for Disease Control and the United States Public Health Service. The study was halted only after news of it was leaked to the press. It resulted in over 100 of the patients dying from syphilis, 40 of their wives contracting syphilis, and 19 of their children contracting it. This is just another example of racial oppression that went on well into the 20th century. These examples help detail what life was like for minority citizens all over the country, before and even after racial discrimination was made illegal.
Understanding a small part of the severity of racial discrimination in the past should make it clear that even if we did live in a post-racial society somehow, the historical discrimination that went on in the past still has a major effect on our society today, which would still make the post-racial rhetoric very invalid. To illustrate this, a while back, friends and I used a track to give a visual example of what this would look like.
Whenever the issue of compensatory or preferential treatment for the Negro is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask for nothing more. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but it is not realistic. For it is obvious that if a man is entering the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. Martin Luther King Jr.
When I read this quote by Martin Luther King, it really helped me understand how the past affects the future and how privilege and disadvantage are both things that can be passed on intergenerationally. To illustrate this, we're going to show a visual example.
This example does not represent the struggles of women, Asian Americans, Native Americans, or the various waves of European immigrants in this country. It is to be used only as a representation of how the transfer of wealth and opportunity has been stifled by discrimination and oppression for some Americans.
Welcome to the generational race to the American dream.
Woo! Yeah, okay.
We live in America where anything is possible, where anyone can do anything, because everything is completely equal.
Yeah.
All you have to do is run your lap and pass your advantages on to the next generation, and you and your descendants will reach the American dream. That's all you have to do. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
All right. You guys can start running in 3, 2, 1. Go. Wait. Sorry, except you guys. Good luck.
Good luck, yeah.
I'm sorry. Because of some barriers throughout American history, there are a couple of restrictions as to who can start and when. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have read the fine print. Because of discrimination during the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, and being segregated to field hand jobs, the stealing of Mexico's land in the Southwest, and the dehumanization of Hispanic immigrants that continues to today, people of Latin descent will have to wait 10 more seconds to start running. Okay, now you can go. Good luck. Due to 300 years of slavery in North America, Jim Crow laws that in many ways kept African Americans in similar conditions to slavery, and continued discrimination and racial oppression, throughout American history, you all will have to wait about 15 more seconds in all. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. All right, so 3, 2, 1. Now you can go. Good luck. You go, brother. Although this example isn't perfect, it should get the point across. It should show that the unequal opportunity minorities faced, in some cases hundreds of years ago, still created an unequal playing field that was passed down through the generations. This playing field is one each generation can only inherit or run with. No generation can even the playing field or start the race over. Although the barriers that existed hundreds of years ago don't legally exist today, the repercussions those barriers caused for minorities hundreds of years ago do still exist because their descendants carry those repercussions with them. If my great-grandfather couldn't get a good job and a decent education because he was black, that would have a direct effect on my grandfather's quality of life and his chances at getting the same thing, which therefore would affect my father's life, and so on. Of course, this can't be applied to every individual that is a minority, but again, due to the unique barriers each minority group has faced, in many cases, one runner will have to run twice as hard just to get to the same place as another on the track. The equality that came as a result of the Civil Rights Movement did not erase the inequality of American history. It did not even up the race. It just allowed minorities to get in on the game. Keep in mind, this was a game that had been going on for hundreds of years at this point. Programs like affirmative action that are often misinterpreted have been created to even this playing field. Despite efforts to make things more equal, the racial inequity that occurred generations ago still is one of the many causes of racial inequity today. Now that a better understanding of how racial discrimination existed in the past has been established, I want to further contradict the idea of our society being post-racial by showing how discrimination still exists today. Filming this documentary over the last few weeks, I've educated myself on the many ways employment discrimination still exists in modern day society. For example, one article I read by writer Joe Fagan details a study by MIT in the early 2000s stating that people with supposedly white-sounding names were 50% more likely to be contacted by employers than those with black-sounding names. This study was conducted by sending out applications, all with the exact same credentials, to employers in Chicago and Boston. The only difference between the applications was that they used made-up names that sounded stereotypically white and black. Even when increasing the credentials of the job applicants with the black-sounding names, the white applicants were far more likely to get a call back from an employer. This MIT study is a clear example of how race, even today, can still affect someone's job opportunities. Another study, done by a sociologist from Northwestern University, found that in the city of Milwaukee, African Americans without criminal records are 3% less likely to be hired than white Americans with criminal records. Although this is just one city in the country, it still shows legitimate issues that minorities encounter when finding jobs, and even more so shows the advantages that some white Americans can be given over minorities in the hiring process. One reason for this could be that white non-Hispanic Americans account for 85% of all manager-level jobs in the United States, while only making up 63% of the population. Another reason could be that many businesses that operate in mostly white areas try to have a staff that reflects the racial background of their clients. Whatever the reason for it is, it's clear that racial discrimination still happens in regards to employment. Even though it isn't as severe as the employment discrimination that minorities faced before the Civil Rights Movement, it still is an issue. Even with the steps towards equality that have been made, these are still clear examples that even 52 years after employment discrimination was made illegal, it still goes on and can still affect your employment opportunities if you're a person of color. Just like employment discrimination, Housing segregation was a real issue for many minorities before the Fair Housing Act was passed by Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Racial exclusion had detrimental economic effects for minority communities, and it was a major contributor to economic inequity between white Americans and people of color. While researching this topic, I found that although the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made housing discrimination and de facto housing segregation illegal, it by no means eliminated it from our country. According to a study cited in an article by Kenneth Jost, who is a lawyer, author, and editor at CQ Researcher, as of 2010, 1/3 of all African American people that live in cities live in highly segregated areas. Many studies show that some of the residential segregation that can be seen today is still a result of racial discrimination, just like it was 100 years ago.
Minorities continue to face discrimination at the hands of real estate brokers who screen racial and ethnic minorities from buying and renting in non-minority areas. The Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Many studies found that a trend called racial steering is very common. Racial steering is a primary cause of modern housing segregation. One study cited by Claude Fisher in his book Cracking the Bell Curve Myth exemplify what the subtleties of racial steering look like in the modern day. The study had black and white researchers pose as home seekers and approach realtors, agents, lenders, and landlords about places they could potentially live, while all having identical credentials. According to the study, at least half of the time discrimination occurred. The discrimination occurred through the African American applicants all being shown the exact same apartments in the exact same neighborhoods, while the white applicants were given a much greater variety of where they could potentially live. The National Fair Housing Alliance did a very similar study to the one just mentioned in 2013 of 28 metropolitan areas across the country. They found that African Americans, Latinos, and Asians seeking apartments to rent were told about and or shown less apartments than white Americans. Among home buyers, African Americans and Asians were shown fewer homes than white Americans, and both of these studies show that modern day housing discrimination isn't explicit like it once was. It doesn't look like a group of white men in hoods chasing a black family out of a neighborhood anymore. Housing discrimination is now much more subtle. It comes with a smile, but it's still a continuation of the housing discrimination that has gone on for decades. It's really troubling realizing that racial segregation in schools was the cause of racial inequity in school funding, because I've come across more and more research that says racial segregation in schools is still an issue.
Minority children who might be otherwise destined to do well academically do not do well because they are in segregated settings with concentrated problems that lead them to learn less. Claude Fisher, Inequality by Design.
According to a study done by the University of California's Civil Rights Project, as of 2011, 43% of Latinos and 38% of all African American students attended schools in which 10% or less of the student population was white. According to that same study, school integration peaked in 1988 and has since been overtaken by a fast and steady turn back towards segregation. In the last 25 years, Latino students have faced the most extreme turn as far as school resegregation, and in recent years have become the most racially isolated group in the school system. The study says that these rates of racial separation are slightly worse than they were in 1968. School segregation is most severe in the northeastern part of the country. Half of all black students in the Northeast attend schools that are 90 to 100% minority. Some researchers say that the increase in school segregation is due to the fact that many of the original integration laws have been deemed unnecessary and taken away. Other researchers say that the increase in segregation is just a result of the declining white population and increasing minority population in the country. Either way, it's important to note that whether or not the change back to more segregated schools is related to, in any way, discrimination or a declining sense of the importance of integration, the regression back to more segregated schools still result in discrimination and continued racial disparity in education, just like it did before the Brown versus Board ruling. According to a study done by the Center for American Progress in 2013, as a nation, we spend $293 less per year on students in heavily minority schools than students in all other schools. The study also found that an increase of just 10% of students of color is associated with a decrease in spending of $75 per student. Across the country, schools spend $334 more on every white student than on every non-white student. Most deniers of the clear racial disparities in school funding will say this is a result of the difference in property taxes between school districts, which would naturally result in different school districts that have different racial makeups receiving different amounts of funds. But according to the study, 40% of the difference in school spending on minority and white students actually occurs in the same school districts.
Black students who attended a school under court-ordered integration were more likely to graduate, attend college, and earn more money than black students who attended segregated schools. The National Bureau of Economic Research.
Of course, it's not that students of color automatically do better when around white students. It's just the unfortunate fact that more white students in many cases means more funding for schools, which in turn results in students of color performing better. This was the reason for the integration of schools in the first place. Diversity in schools meant a better education for students of color simply because white students received more resources than students that weren't white. 60 years after the Brown versus Board ruling, this is clearly still the case. Ironically, the decrease in integration laws is based on the idea that this isn't the case anymore. The recent push by lawmakers to stop forcing schools to integrate is based on the idea that the number of white students in a school don't affect how much funding that school gets. But even in the modern day, that belief is not fact. Segregation in schools is still an issue, and it still affects the quality of education that students of color receive all over the country. Despite racial progress in the area of education, research shows that race can still affect the quality of education a student gets. This, along with the clear racial discrimination that still goes on in the job and housing markets, are all indicators that we do not live in a post-racial society. So far, we've analyzed what happened and what continues to happen when people of the majority hold racist beliefs about and discriminate against minorities. But while doing this documentary, I realized that one often overlooked effect of institutional racism is internalized racism, which basically is when people of color hold racist beliefs about themselves.
I want to quote my predecessor, actually Bishop T. Gary Benjamin, because I heard him say this first. Racism is the white racist problem, but it is the black man's burden. So internalized racism is the burden of black people who have been the victims of racism. So when we internalize racism, we internalize the hatred that others have for us as black people. And that manifests itself in many, many different ways. Definitely manifests itself in black self-hate. It manifests itself in black self-annihilation in service of white domination and white supremacy. It manifests itself in the many ways we destroy ourselves in our own communities, because now we've internalized that hate, which is also a form of self-hate. But when we get back to racism, racism is also a political term. So it's more than just a psychological concept. It's a very, very destructive yet powerful political tool that, when used properly, it's been used and systematized to hold an entire group of people down. So when we internalize that racism, we give in to that systematized oppression that has been manifested by the politics of racism. So racism permeates every facet of our society in America.
When learning about the concept of internalized racism, The obvious question was what have been and continue to be the vehicles that have allowed many different peoples of color to begin to believe negative stereotypes about their own racial and ethnic groups. After doing some research, I believe the media, historically and currently, is the primary culprit. Specifically American films, news programs, television shows, and magazines.
Whether played by blacks or black-faced whites, the cinematic African-American male was usually a simple-minded buffoon, quick to laugh, irresponsible, lazy, fearful, and rhythmic. His female counterpart was good-natured, motherly, yet sometimes sassy, able to work but complaining about it, and employed as a cook, seamstress, or servant. James Waller, Face to Face.
Throughout the history of American television and films, minorities have been presented in a largely negative light. Minority characters have been a part of American cinema since its beginning, and originally weren't even portrayed by people of color. In my opinion, besides films, news stations and their overrepresentation of minorities as criminals plays into internalized racism as well.
Another study found that whites represented 43% of homicide victims in the local news, but only 13% of homicide victims in crime reports. And while only 10% of victims in crime reports were whites who had been victimized by blacks, these crimes made up 42% of televised cases. These disparities exist nationwide and are greatest when the victim's race is taken into consideration. Richard Prince.
Because of these news trends cited in the previous quote, negative stereotypes about people of color continue to be perpetuated and unfactual associations between people of color and crimes continue to be made. When these associations begin to be made by people of color, about people of color, in my opinion, internalized racism over time tends to be the result. Another sector in American society that I believe over time has caused internalized racism amongst minorities is the fact that European beauty standards are almost always the typical representation of what beauty is, especially in the Western world.
I lusted after white girls and white women more than I lusted after Indian girls and Indian women. Television taught me to do this. Television taught me that the bodies of white women were more beautiful than the bodies of brown women. Television taught me white skin was inherently good and pure, but that brown skin was inherently evil and dirty. I learned to hate my brown skin. Sherman Alexie, Reservation Blues.
Advertisement campaigns, magazines, billboards, and so on all mostly use white people, specifically white women, to represent what beauty is. These standards are so common that even children are aware of them by a young age. This has been proven through the famous doll test experiment.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
I believe negative stereotypes being handed down through the generations about people of color, by white people, and people of color themselves, along with the media, play a huge role in the development of internalized racism. Those are what I believe are the main causes. I think that some of the results of internalized racism, if you're a minority, are an underlying feeling of incompetence due to your race. If you're a minority and you subconsciously feel inferior to someone else due to your ethnic heritage, that will have an effect on your self-esteem. It'll affect the way you perceive yourself and those that look just like you. I believe that internalized racism can even limit what a person is able to achieve in life in some cases, because it puts a limit on what someone believes they are capable of achieving. And that limit is often placed subconsciously, so it can be difficult to detect and address. Like the doll test shows, racism can be internalized at an age when you're far too young to be able to consciously reject negative stereotypes about your own ethnic group, which would cause them to seem normal by the time you're an adult. Another result of internalized racism, especially in regards to appearance, can be a desire to look, comparatively at least, European. Throughout my life, this is something I've noticed in others and even in my own environment. I can remember as a child being told by some friends to stay out of the sun or I'll get darker, not realizing that that warning had a lot to do with the idea of the lighter you are, the better you are. The lighter your skin is, the more attractive you are. Wanting to look white by downplaying your ethnic features or adjusting your skin tone is a very consequential and relevant symptom of internalized racism. So much so that even within minority groups, those that look more white than others, either with facial features and/or skin tone, are often regarded as the most attractive and even looked at as being better in some cases than those that don't comparatively look white. This is called colorism, and in my opinion, this is a result of internalized racism.
One example of this can be seen in a phrase that is common in some Latin American cultures, which translates to advance the race. Advancing the race is said to be done by gradually lightening skin over generations by avoiding having children with people that have dark skin. The fact that to some Latinos, advancing their race coincides with making their families more white over time shows the deep effects European imperialism had and still has on some Latin American countries and cultures, and that internalized racism in the form of wanting to lighten one's own skin can be a result. This trend is also sometimes called blanqueamiento, and up until the early 20th century, it was encouraged by the governments of Brazil and Cuba through legislation. Because of how common the phrase is in some Latin American cultures, its racist roots can be hard for many to accept. Lighter-skinned people of color enjoy substantial privileges that are still unattainable to their darker-skinned brothers and sisters. In fact, light-skinned people earn more money, complete more years of schooling, live in better neighborhoods, and marry higher status people than darker-skinned people of the same race or ethnicity. Margaret Hunter.
In my opinion, the desire of some Latinos to want to implement the advance the race tradition comes from the fact that Margaret Hunter points out in this quote. If you're a person of color, having lighter skin can work to your advantage in many ways in Western societies. The African American community has adjusted to white supremacy with its own forms of internalized racism in regards to appearance in many ways. The color-based hierarchy implemented during slavery by white slave masters has been maintained in the black community by some African American people, in my opinion. Some African Americans subconsciously still consider lighter African Americans to be more attractive and overall better than darker African Americans. Some even attribute certain characteristics to lighter African Americans versus darker African Americans.
The maintenance of white supremacy is predicated on the notion that dark skin represents savagery, irrationality, ugliness, and inferiority. White skin, and thus whiteness itself, is defined by the opposite: civility, rationality, beauty, and superiority. Margaret Hunter.
In my experience, amongst African American youth today, it's common to associate lighter-skinned males with being softer and more effeminate, while darker-skinned males are stereotyped as being more sinister and aggressive. Lighter-skinned African-American females are sometimes seen as being more attractive compared to darker African-American females. All of these issues, in my opinion, are a result of internalized racism. Internalized racism is a serious issue, and in my opinion, it is one of many results of Western European imperialism. I believe European imperialism, in many ways, was what caused Europeans to first create racist ideologies about themselves in relation to people of color. This was done to justify all the horrible things that were done to human beings as a result of imperialism, like the slave trade or the colonization of many Latin American, African, and Asian countries. The racism created as a result of imperialism was then maintained in European colonies afterwards, including the United States. Racism in all of its institutionalized forms was then used to oppress and also justify the oppression of many groups of people to different degrees, including African, Latino, Asian, and Native Americans. This oppression created racial inequity in all areas of life between ethnic minorities and the white majority of this country. In my opinion, racial inequity was especially noticeable, like I've mentioned, in the areas of employment, housing, and education. The generational effects of discrimination in these three sectors of American life was not erased after racial discrimination and segregation was made illegal. Even after segregation and discrimination was made illegal, it still occurred and still does today. The discrimination that still goes on in American society and the discrimination that once went on that hasn't been rectified are both obvious practical reasons as to why the United States is not a post-racial society.
Despite that, as a country, we have made many strides to create racial equality. We are far more racially equal as a society than we were 100 years ago, and ethnic minorities all over the country can do and achieve things that even my great-grandparents would have thought impossible. With that being said, why should we even mention the discrimination that still occurs? African Americans aren't being hung from trees anymore. Chinese Americans aren't being chased off of job sites by angry mobs anymore. Minorities don't have to sit in the back of buses. The discrimination that goes on now isn't like how it was before, so why should we as a society not just be content with that?
One obvious answer to me is that we shouldn't be content with this because we live in the United States. We live in a country that boasts about and has boasted about its freedoms and equal opportunities for centuries. But after 241 years of this country's existence, we still haven't fully lived up to the ideals this country was founded on. Martin Luther King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The racial discrimination that still exists is a result of continued injustice. This injustice is a threat to American ideals and justice in this society as a whole. There is serious racial division that has always existed and still exists in our society today. In my opinion, to get rid of the division, we must first have an in-depth understanding of the racism that is responsible for much of the division in our society. And in my opinion, it starts with education.
We must educate ourselves on how racial discrimination manifests itself in all aspects of society. All citizens should be educated on the history of discrimination and how it continues. All citizens should be educated on the way in which magazines, films, and news reporting plays into fueling racism. And everyone should be educated on the reality of internalized racism. Since racial discrimination does still occur, since we don't live in a post-racial society, being colorblind, like some people like to say, or not paying attention to color in an attempt to not be racist will only make things worse. Instead of being colorblind, we must become what many writers have called color conscious.
Which means to take into account the way in which race can still affect a person's day-to-day life, while at the same time being intelligent enough to know the difference between being conscious of someone's race and then stereotyping them because of their race. Last but not least, we must never underestimate how deeply racism still is interwoven into our society. Like I said before, to overcome division, we as a country must examine and have a critical understanding of what it is that divides us.
Once this critical understanding is held by the majority of our country, maybe then we could one day live in a post-racial society.
Well, there's no duo I'd rather be in than you and me. You and me. If I was sent to the end of the earth, it's alright as long as there's you and me. You and me. There's no weapon, there's no army, no declaration, there's no country, there is nothing, nothing and nobody can separate you and me.